The wind had been howling across the Turner Ranch since sundown, dragging dust and cold through the valley. Inside the old farmhouse, Eli Turner sat beside a dying fire. The only sound the creak of wood and the low hum of a lonely clock. The table beside him held a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. Nights like this were always the hardest. Nights when memories sounded louder than the wind once. Laughter had filled these walls. His wife, Mary, used to hum while stirring stew, and his little boy, Sam, would race toy horses along the floorboards, but that was 5 winters ago. One accident, one runaway horse, and the warmth of his home was gone since then. Eli had lived like the land he worked, wide, empty, and waiting for something that would never return. Then came the knock. It was faint at first. A soft tapping nearly lost in the wind. Eli frowned. Setting down his mug, another knock followed, this one firmer. Hurried. He rose slowly. Boots scuffing against the worn floorboards. No one came this far out after dark when he pulled open the heavy oak door. The cold bit into him, and so did the sight that waited there. 2 children stood on his porch, a boy, maybe 10, and a little girl clinging to his sleeve. Their clothes were ragged, their faces streaked with dust and tears. The boy's voice trembled as he spoke, barely louder than the wind. "Sir, our daddy died today," he said. "Can we sleep in your barn tonight?" Eli froze. The girl's eyes, wide, glassy, too old for her age, met his, and something inside him cracked. He hadn't heard a child's voice in years, not like this, small, scared. Desperate for a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretching like the night around them. "You walked here?" he asked finally. The boy nodded. "We was with Daddy near the river. He got sick. We waited. But he didn't wake up. We buried him there." His voice broke. But he kept standing straight, trying to be a man. "We just need a place to sleep. Sir, we won't cause trouble." Eli's throat tightened. His instinct told him to stay quiet, to shut the door, to keep his world simple and untouched. But his heart, that tired, hidden thing, began to ache. He looked past them at the empty yard, the barn barely visible under the snow-dusted dark. "You hungry?" he asked softly. The boy hesitated, glancing at his sister, who looked up with hollow eyes. "A little," she whispered. Eli opened the door wider. "Then come in." They stepped inside, shivering, eyes darting around the small, tidy room. The girl clutched a small wooden horse, a keepsake. Worn smooth by her hand, Ellie poured warm stew into bowls and slid them across the table. They ate fast, too fast. Like children who hadn't known a meal in days, he watched in silence, the way the girl's shoulders relaxed, the way the boy finally allowed himself to look small again. Something gentle stirred inside him, like embers rekindling when they finished. He pointed toward the spare room. "You can sleep there tonight. It's warm." The boy hesitated. "Thank you. Sir will be gone in the morning." Eli looked at the fire, then back at them. "No hurry," he said. "Get some rest." He stayed awake long after they had fallen asleep. The house no longer silent but breathing again. The wind still howled outside, but it no longer sounded so lonely. For the first time in 5 years, Eli Turner felt like he wasn't the only soul left on earth. The morning sun crept slowly over the hills, spilling light across the valley like honey over frost. Eli Turner stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and looked out at the endless prairie. The air was sharp and cold, but there was something different about it, a pulse of life stirring again on the land he'd thought had long gone silent behind him. From inside the house came the soft sound of footsteps. The 2 children, Tommy and Lydia, as he'd learned over breakfast, stood shyly by the kitchen door. Lydia's small hands wrapped around a steaming mug of milk, her hair tangled and sun-bleached. Tommy, though only 10, tried to stand tall like a man. He kept thanking Eli for letting us sleep inside instead of the barn. Eli nodded, his voice gruff but kind. "You both are safe here. Eat first. We'll talk after." They sat at the wooden table where Mary once served Sunday breakfasts, watching them. Eli's chest tightened with an ache both painful and strangely comforting. The girl smiled faintly as she tasted real food, bread and eggs, while her brother, cautious at first, finally let himself eat without guilt after a long silence. Eli asked, "How long were you two out there?" Tommy wiped his mouth, hesitant. "A few days. We was camped near the river. Daddy was sick a while, coughing real bad, said he just needed rest, but—" His voice broke. Lydia's small fingers gripped his sleeve. "He didn't wake up." Eli stared at the boy's trembling hands, the same way his own sons had once clutched his arm after a nightmare. "And your ma?" he asked quietly. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "She went to heaven when I was little." The room went still outside. The wind brushed across the window pane like a whisper. Eli swallowed hard. "You buried him?" Tommy nodded. "Made a cross from sticks, didn't want the coyotes to get him." Silence fell heavy between them. Eli looked at their small faces, faces that had seen too much of the world too soon. Something inside him, long buried beneath grief and loneliness, began to thaw. "You did good," he said finally. "Real good." Tommy blinked. Surprised by the kindness in the old man's voice, Eli stood. Walking to the window, the field stretched wide and open, waiting for spring planting for years. He'd worked that land alone, eating in silence, sleeping beside ghosts, but this morning, the house smelled like breakfast and sounded like breathing. It didn't feel empty anymore. "You two can stay as long as you need," he said at last. Not turning around, Tommy shook his head quickly. "We don't want to be trouble." "Sir, we can help with chores. Honest, I can feed animals." "Fix fences." Eli faced him. "Ain't about trouble. It's about doing what's right. You're just kids." The boy's lips parted. Unsure how to respond for the first time since their father's death, he allowed himself to relax, to let someone else carry the weight. Lydia climbed into the big armchair by the fire and fell asleep within minutes, a small smile softening her face. Eli sat across from her, watching the flames dance. The quiet was different now, no longer hollow but peaceful. He thought of Mary and Sam, and how they'd once filled this room with laughter. The ache remained, but it didn't hurt the same way by evening. Tommy had insisted on helping feed the horses. Eli handed him a pail, watching as the boy stumbled through the barnyard mud, determined not to seem weak. The old rancher almost smiled that night after the children were asleep. Eli stepped outside again. The stars spread wide and endless above him. He took a deep breath of the cool air, feeling the warmth of the house glowing behind him, opened his door to two strangers. But somehow, they had brought home back to him. The days at Turner Ranch began to take on a rhythm the house hadn't known in years. Eli Turner woke with the sun, listening to the sound of the prairie wind threading through the windows. But it wasn't just the wind anymore. It was the quiet shuffle of small feet on the wooden floor, the soft voices of Tommy and Lydia as they moved about the house. The sound was gentle, like a melody waking an old instrument, but it stirred something deep inside him. Hope. Eli watched from the porch one morning as the children ran barefoot across the dew-covered yard. Lydia laughed as she chased a stray calf, her hair shining like gold in the rising sun, while Tommy carried buckets of water to the barn, his small shoulders straight and determined. Eli's heart swelled as he saw them working together, helping each other, and yet still finding the innocence of childhood in between the chores. "Careful with that." "Tommy," Eli called, his voice rough but warm. "You'll spill half the water before the horses even drink it." Tommy glanced back with a sheepish grin. "I'll be careful, sir. I promise." Eli shook his head and smiled faintly. "Careful," he says, as if he had a lifetime to teach them all the lessons inside. The children were learning not just about chores, but about belonging. Lydia helped Eli bake bread and patch clothes, her small fingers clumsy at first but growing skillful with each attempt. The house once silent and somber, now smelled of fresh bread, pine polish, and the faint scent of soap. The walls seemed to lean in closer, listening to laughter instead of echoing emptiness. But life on the prairie was not just about joy, it was about work, responsibility, and learning to trust again. Eli took the children out to the fields, teaching them to mend fences, care for the horses, and feed the cattle. At first, their hands trembled and their movements were hesitant. The boy would drop tools, the girl would stumble over gates, but each day they grew stronger, more confident, more like children who had a home. The neighboring town of Red Creek began to notice the change too. When Eli rode into town to buy supplies, he could feel the gazes of townsfolk following him, some wary, some skeptical, and a few genuinely curious whispers trailed behind him. The old ranchers taken in strays. Some doubted, some admired, but Eli paid no mind. His life, and now theirs, was no longer shaped by gossip. By the end of the week, something remarkable happened. Eli sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of his grief pressing down. The children came running toward him, muddy and bright-eyed, carrying bundles of hay for the horses. Lydia threw herself into his arms, laughing, and even Tommy allowed a small, triumphant smile. "You're not so bad at this, sir," Tommy said, pride lighting his young face. "Not bad?" Eli asked with a mock frown. "I've been running this ranch longer than you've been alive." They laughed, the sound mingling with the rustling of the wind through the tall grasses. Eli's chest felt lighter than it had in years. The home that had been hollow, that had echoed only with the memories of loss, was alive again. The walls, the barn, the fields, all of it had found a rhythm with the children. That night, after they were asleep, Eli sat by the fire, watching the embers flicker. He thought about Mary and Sam and the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. But now, with Tommy and Lydia, he realized that home wasn't a building or a set of walls. It was life shared, laughter returned, and hearts opened to love once more. The ranch had been silent for too long, but now, for the first time in years, it was truly alive. The days at Turner Ranch had begun to settle into a comforting rhythm. Yet Eli Turner knew the peace was fragile. Life had a way of testing those who dared to heal. Though Tommy and Lydia laughed and played in the fields, shadows of the past lingered in Eli's heart, refusing to be quieted. One morning, just as the sun kissed the prairie hills, a horse approached from the winding dirt road. A stranger rode steadily toward the farmhouse, wearing the robes of a traveling preacher, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He slowed near the gate, tipping his hat as Eli emerged from the porch. "Mr. Turner?" The man called, voice firm but gentle. "I'm looking for two children, siblings. Do you know them?" Eli's hand instinctively went to his hip. "Though no gun was there, depends on who's asking," he said cautiously. His eyes scanned the man's face, searching for threat, but there was none, only concern and quiet authority. "I knew their father," the preacher said, pulling a weathered piece of paper from his satchel. "He asked me to check on them. In case anything happened, they're safe, I hope?" Eli's jaw tightened. "They are now." He felt a pang in his chest, one that had nothing to do with anger. This stranger was a reminder that the children's past was still tethered to the wider world. They weren't just orphans lost to the prairie. They were connected to someone he'd never met. Tommy and Lydia emerged from the porch, sensing the tension. "It's okay," Eli whispered. "Just tell him you're all right." The preacher knelt, meeting their eyes. "Your father wanted to make sure you had someone to protect you," he said softly. "Seems he found the right man." The words stung Eli in unexpected ways. He had spent years isolating himself, believing that he could never love again, that he could never care without opening himself to unbearable pain. The accident that had taken his wife and son had left him brittle. Cautious and lonely, he had promised himself no one would ever break that wall again but looking at Tommy and Lydia. He realized the wall was already falling, the children needed him, and he needed them. "You'll not be leaving, I hope?" the preacher asked, a knowing look in his eyes. "They're staying," Eli said firmly. "This is their home now." "Just as much as mine." The preacher nodded, satisfaction softening his features. He told the children a few stories about their father, speaking of his kindness and gentle heart, of the love he had for them even in death. Tommy listened with wide eyes, and Lydia clung to the preacher's hand, tears welling, not just for loss but for the comfort of knowing that someone had remembered once the man departed. Eli stood silently on the porch, staring out at the horizon. He thought of Mary and Sam, of the years he had spent trapped in grief, and of the new family that now surrounded him. He understood that shadows of the past would never fully disappear. Grief, loss, and memory were part of life, but they could be tempered by love, by care, and by presence. That evening, Eli sat with the children by the fire, reading aloud from an old book he'd kept on the shelf since Mary had died. Tommy and Lydia leaned against him, safe, their small hands warm in his. He realized the ranch was no longer just land and livestock. It was the center of their reborn lives, a place where healing could take root. The past had come to visit, and Eli had faced it now. It could no longer rule them. The wind whispered outside, and the fire crackled inside. Shadows remained, but for the first time in years, Eli felt strong enough to hold them at bay, with the children by his side. The ranch was more than a home. It was a sanctuary. The prairie was unusually dry that spring, the grasses brittle and golden under the relentless sun. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke, but Eli Turner paid it little mind. Life had been quiet, the ranch flourishing with the laughter and energy of Tommy and Lydia. The children had grown comfortable in their routines, chores in the morning, lessons in the afternoon, and evenings by the fire. But peace on the prairie was often fleeting. It was late afternoon when Eli first noticed the flicker of orange against the distant ridge. At first, he thought it was the setting sun, but as he squinted, the flicker grew brighter, hotter, a living thing consuming the dry grass. The smell of smoke hit him, sharp and acrid. A fire had begun, racing toward the ranch. "Tommy, Lydia!" he shouted, grabbing his hat and striding toward the barn. The children were already running toward him, faces pale with fear. "We have to move fast." The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by the wind, and dry prairie flames licked the edges of fences, hungrily consuming anything in their path. Horses whinnied and stamped. Panicked by the roaring inferno, the children froze for a moment, gripping each other, until Eli grabbed their hands and pulled them into action. "Buckets? Water, now!" he barked. They ran, filling pails from the creek while Eli coordinated with the ranch hands, directing them to form fire breaks, wet down barns, and lead the animals to safety. The smoke choked their lungs, and ash fell like snow, but Eli's focus never wavered. Suddenly, a panicked shout rang out. Tommy had gotten too close to the edge of the barn and was trapped by a sudden flare of fire. "Dad!" Lydia screamed. Eli ran, breaking through the smoke and heat, his eyes watering. The fire roared like a living beast, but he pushed forward, lifting the boy from the ground. Tommy clung to him tightly, coughing but alive. "You okay?" Eli asked, his voice rough but steady. Tommy nodded, shaking, and looked up at his father figure with awe and relief. "Yeah." "Thanks, sir." Lydia ran to hug both of them. Soot on her cheeks, tears streaked through the dust. The three huddled together as the fire consumed part of the northern field, leaving behind a scarred, blackened landscape by nightfall. The men had finally contained the blaze. The barn was partially burned, fences destroyed, and part of the hayfields reduced to ash, but the animals were safe. The children were safe, and for Eli, that was everything. Exhausted, they sat on the porch. Watching smoke curl into the sky, Lydia leaned against Eli's shoulder, and Tommy rested his head on her lap. The fire had been a test, one that had threatened not only the ranch but their fragile new family, but they had survived, and the bond between them had grown stronger. Eli's chest ached with relief and pride. "You too," he said, voice low. "You were brave today." Tommy shook his head. "You were braver." "Sir, you saved us." Eli smiled faintly, eyes on the stars beginning to pierce the dark sky. "No," he said softly. "We saved each other." In the following days, rebuilding began. The barn was repaired, fences mended, and the fields cleared. But more than that, something intangible had been renewed: trust, courage, and a sense that the ranch was truly theirs. The fire had tested their hearts and souls, and they had emerged stronger, closer, and more united. For Eli, the lesson was clear. This was no longer just a home for stray children. It was a family. And families weather storms, literal and metaphorical, together that night. He looked out over the prairie, flames now gone, stars twinkling above, and whispered almost to himself, "You're safe here, and you always will be." The prairie was bathed in golden light as spring settled fully into the valley. Silver grasses swayed in gentle breezes, and the farm felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. The morning air carried birdsong, the low murmur of cows, and the laughter of Tommy and Lydia, who were already chasing each other across the fields. The sound made Eli Turner's chest swell with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The children had grown noticeably since that cold night when they first appeared at his door. Lydia's once matted hair gleamed in the sun, and Tommy's shoulders had straightened. His confidence growing with each passing day. They moved as though the ranch had always been theirs, which, in truth, it now was for Eli. The sight of them thriving was a balm to years of grief he had carried alone inside the house. The warmth of life radiated everywhere. Breakfast was shared at the long oak table, where the smell of fresh bread, eggs, and brewed coffee filled the air. The house, once quiet and empty, was now alive with chatter, occasional mischief, and the comforting sounds of belonging. Eli paused at the doorframe. Watching the scene unfold, he thought of Mary and Sam, the family he had lost, and realized that the ranch had given him a second chance, not to replace the past, but to create a future. By mid-morning, chores began. Eli guided the children in the fields, teaching them to mend fences, water crops, and tend to the animals. Their small hands worked alongside his, tentative at first. Then, with growing confidence, they learned not only the practical tasks of ranch life, but also the lessons of responsibility, care, and perseverance. Eli watched them, heart swelling, aware that he had never imagined anyone could bring so much warmth to his once lonely land neighbors. From Red Creek had begun to notice the change as well. Whispers of admiration replaced earlier skepticism. People began stopping by with small gifts, a sack of flour, a hand-knit scarf, or an offer to help with the harvest. The ranch, once isolated, had become a symbol of resilience and kindness, a place where people could see the tangible results of love, care, and human connection. One evening, Eli stood on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Tommy approached with a small bundle of freshly picked flowers. Lydia followed, balancing a basket of eggs, and together they handed their treasures to Eli. "You really made this place ours, sir," Tommy said, pride shining in his eyes. Eli's throat tightened. "No," he replied softly. "We made this place together." The children beamed, understanding more in that moment than words could express. For Eli, the act of giving them a home had become a gift to himself. He had learned that family wasn't defined solely by blood, but by presence, care, and love freely given. That night, the fire burned low in the hearth. The children snuggled under thick blankets, and Eli sat nearby. Reading from a worn book he had kept since Mary's passing, he glanced at them, their faces calm in sleep, and whispered, almost reverently, "You can stay forever." The words carried weight. Not only for the children, but for Eli himself. They were no longer orphans wandering through a harsh world, nor was he a man trapped in grief and solitude together. They had forged a home, a sanctuary of love, trust, and belonging outside. The stars twinkled endlessly over the prairie, their quiet light reflecting the peace that had settled over the ranch. The land that had once seemed lonely and barren was now alive with family, laughter, and hope. Eli realized as he watched the gentle rise and fall of the children's breaths that home was not a structure but a feeling, one built from care, sacrifice, and unwavering presence. The night deepened, but the warmth inside the Turner Ranch remained. Steadfast life, in all its fragile and beautiful forms, had returned. Eli's heart, once hardened by loss, had opened fully, and with a soft smile he knew it had been the knock on his door and the trust of two small children that had finally healed him. They were home, and they would stay forever.